2 weeks before she died, Julie Jensen walked next door, handed her neighbors a sealed envelope, and said something no wife and mother in a quiet Wisconsin neighborhood should ever have to say. She told them, "If anything ever happens to me, give this to the police." Then she turned around and walked back home, to her husband and to her 2 little boys. That envelope sat untouched until the morning of December 3rd, 1998, the morning Julie was found dead in her own bed. She was 40 years old. And the moment investigators opened it, what had looked like a quiet domestic tragedy became one of the most chilling murder cases in American legal history. Because Julie Jensen had not just left behind a warning, she had left behind a name, and that name was her husband's. This is the story of a woman who saw exactly what was coming for her. She documented it. She reported it. She named it out loud to anyone who would listen, and she still did not make it out in time. You're watching Dark Truth Crime, where we go past the headlines and into the human story underneath. If you believe a victim's own voice deserves to be heard, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so these stories keep reaching the people who need to hear them. And before we go any further, tell me down in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. There's a particular kind of horror in this story, and it is not the horror of a stranger in the dark. It is the horror of the familiar. The danger to Julie did not climb through a window in the middle of the night. It sat across from her at the dinner table. It tucked her children into bed. It answered the door when the neighbors came by. To understand how a thing like that becomes possible, you have to go back to the very beginning, long before the envelope and the antifreeze, to the girl Julie was before she was anyone's wife. Julie Carol Griffin was born in the late 1950s. She was the only daughter in a close family, surrounded by brothers who would one day fight for her memory in a courtroom for the better part of 2 decades. By every account from the people who knew her, Julie was the kind of person who felt things deeply. Maybe she felt them too deeply. She had a tenderness to her, a way of carrying other people's pain as if it were her own, and the people who loved her would later say that this softness was both the most beautiful thing about her and the thing that left her exposed. She studied nursing in college because she wanted to take care of people. She was bright and more than capable of doing the work. But she never finished her degree, and according to her family, it was not the difficulty of the coursework that stopped her. It was the emotional weight of it. Julie became too attached to her patients. She could not switch it off when she walked out of the hospital at the end of a shift. She carried them home with her, and that one detail tells you almost everything you need to know about who Julie was. She was a woman built for love, not for distance. She absorbed the suffering of others instead of holding it at arm's length. She met Mark Jensen when they were both young. He was ambitious, driven, the kind of young man people described as going places. He was on track to become a stockbroker, a man with a plan and the energy to chase it. Julie's family later said that ambition was part of what drew her to him. They went through college in the same years. They built a future together. And in the spring of 1984, on the 14th of April, Julie and Mark got married. But the night before the wedding, Julie's world cracked open in a way that would shadow the rest of her life. During the rehearsal, her mother collapsed to her. The family later came to understand that what they were watching was the toll of alcoholism and depression. Julie loved her mother, and she was terrified of becoming her. Years later, Mark's own mother would describe how Julie lived with a quiet, constant dread of turning into the woman she had watched struggle. That fear was an inheritance Julie never asked for, and it would follow her all the way to the end of her life. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Mark and Julie had settled into a neighborhood in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, a quiet community near the shore of Lake Michigan, about 40 miles south of Milwaukee. Mark worked in finance. Julie kept the home and raised their sons. From the outside, it was the picture of a life you were supposed to want. A house, a steady career, a marriage, 2 children, everything in its place. But underneath that picture, something had already gone wrong. In the early 1990s, after the couple's first son, David, was born, Julie had a brief affair with a co-worker. She admitted to it. She even filed for divorce, and then she changed her mind. The couple went to counseling and decided to stay together. A few years later, in the mid-1990s, their second son, Douglas, was born. To the neighbors, it might have looked like a marriage that had hit a rough patch and recovered. It had not recovered. According to prosecutors and a long line of witnesses, Mark Jensen never truly forgave his wife for that affair. He did not forget it. He did not let it go. And over the years that followed, the marriage curdled into something far darker than ordinary distance. It became a place where one person held a permanent weapon over the other and never once set it down. This is something worth sitting with because it is the engine of the entire tragedy. In a healthy marriage, even a wounded one, a betrayal is something 2 people either work through or walk away from. They forgive, or they divorce, or they live with a manageable distance. What appears to have happened in the Jensen home was something else entirely. Mark did not forgive Julie, and he did not leave her. Instead, prosecutors would argue he kept the affair alive as a justification, a grievance he could feed and nurse and sharpen for years. Julie's single mistake became, in his hands, a life sentence she did not know she was serving. The marriage looked intact from the street. Inside, it had become a slow machine of punishment. Then the strange things started happening. Sometime after Julie's affair became known around the home, a slow campaign of humiliation crept into the Jensens' daily life. Pornographic photographs began appearing where Julie would find them. They were left around the property. They were placed on the family's vehicles. They turned up in places that felt deliberate, designed to unsettle her. The telephone would ring, and when someone answered, the line would go dead. Then it would ring again. It was low, grinding, constant, and it was clearly meant to wear a person down. Julie did not ignore it. This is one of the most important things to understand about her, and it is the thread that runs through this entire story. Julie Jensen responded to fear by gathering evidence, while most people, frightened and confused, might have tried to convince themselves that they were imagining things. Julie did the opposite. She started keeping a logbook. She wrote down every incident, every photograph, every hang-up call, every detail she could capture, with dates and descriptions. She was, in effect, building a record long before she had any idea how badly that record would one day be needed, and then she did something even more telling. She reported it to the Pleasant Prairie Police Department. Think for a moment about what that takes. The harassment was designed to make her feel crazy, to make her doubt her own senses, to isolate her inside her own home. And instead of shrinking, Julie reached outward. She made it official. She put it on the record with the police. That instinct to document and to report is the instinct of a person who is afraid she will not be believed, and who is determined to leave proof behind anyway. An officer named Ron Cosman began investigating the harassment. He worked the case for years, from the mid-1990s up to 1998, trying to figure out who was behind the campaign against Julie. Over time, Officer Cosman developed a suspicion he could not shake. He began to believe that the person tormenting Julie was someone inside her own home. A private investigator, who was also consulted, reached the very same conclusion. But Julie, at that point, could not bring herself to fully accept it. The idea that the man behind the cruelty was her own husband, the father of David and Douglas, was almost too much to hold, so she held on to hope instead. She held on to the version of him she had married. That changed in the autumn of 1998. Something inside Julie shifted that fall. The vague dread she had carried for her. Ears suddenly sharpened into something specific and urgent. She stopped hinting. She started telling people directly that she was afraid her husband was going to kill her. She told her son's third-grade teacher in plain words that she believed Mark was going to kill her. She told her neighbors. She told the police. She was not whispering it into the dark or hinting around the edges of it. She was saying it out loud, to anyone who might be in a position to listen, and to anyone who might remember it later. And then Julie noticed something on the family's home computer. In October of 1998, the browser history began filling up with searches that had no place in a normal household. Searches related to drugs, searches related to poisoning, references to materials associated with causing harm. By November, a search for the word toxicology had led to a page about a chemical called ethylene glycol, the primary toxic ingredient in common antifreeze. Julie did not know what ethylene glycol was. The word meant nothing to her, but she understood in her gut that something in her home was deeply, dangerously wrong. Around the same time, she found a list written in her husband's daily planner. It was not meant for her eyes. The items on it made no sense for an ordinary household. There were references to a drug supply, to a syringe, and to other items that read like the contents of a nightmare, rather than a to-do list. Julie did not know exactly what it meant, but some part of her understood that she might need proof one day, so she photographed it. Think about what that means. She was quietly building a case from inside her own danger, documenting the evidence of a crime that had not happened yet. Sometime in the middle of November, Julie Jensen sat down and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the Pleasant Prairie Police Department, to Officer Cosman, and a detective by name. She described the state of her marriage, how it had collapsed into something polite and hollow. She wrote about how her husband had never forgiven her for the affair years earlier. She included the photograph she had taken of the list in his planner, and she stated something with absolute clarity. She wrote that she would never, under any circumstances, take her own life because of David and Douglas. Her children, she wrote, were her entire world. She would never leave them, and then she wrote the sentence that would echo through 2 trials and 25 years of courtrooms. She wrote that if anything ever happened to her, her husband should be the first suspect. She sealed that letter in an envelope. She carried it next door. Her neighbors, Ted and Margaret Wust, answered the door, and Julie handed it to them with a simple instruction. If anything ever happens to me, give this to the police. The wards took it. They put it somewhere safe, and they waited, hoping they would never have a reason to open it. Julie did not stop there. She also called Officer Cosman and left him voicemail messages. In the second message, she told him plainly that she thought her husband was going to kill her. These were not vague, anxious musings. She was describing an expectation. She was telling a police officer, on a recording, what she believed was about to happen to her. Meanwhile, the man she feared was building a very different story. In the weeks before Julie's death, Mark had been telling friends and acquaintances that his wife was depressed. He described her as struggling, fragile, unwell in her mind. To the people who later examined this case, that looked like something deliberate. It looked like a man laying down a narrative in advance, planning the idea of a depressed and unstable wife before anything had actually happened to her. That is what prosecutors would argue years later. He was writing the ending before the story was over, and he was already living a second life. Mark had been having an affair with a co-worker named Kelly Labonte. While Julie was documenting her own fear and writing letters to the police, her husband was imagining a future with another woman. On the 1st of December, 2 days before she would be found dead, Julie went to see her family doctor. The physician later said she seemed miserable and distraught, visibly shaken by the state of her marriage. He gave her samples of an antidepressant and offered to help arrange counseling. Julie walked out of that office with a prescription and no real answers, carrying a fear that no pill could touch. Picture her in that moment. A woman who had told the police, her neighbors, her son's teacher, and now her doctor that she was afraid for her life, sitting in an examination room being handed a sample packet of pills. The system that was supposed to protect her kept treating the symptom and missing the cause, because the cause was unthinkable. The very next day, December 2nd, Mark walked into the same doctor's office. He told the physician that Julie was having trouble sleeping, and he left with a prescription for sleep medication for her. Read that sequence again slowly. One day, the wife comes in, terrified and distraught. The next day, the husband comes in and collects a prescription for a sedative in her name. That same doctor would later testify that if he had understood the true nature of what was happening, he might have recommended that Julie be hospitalized. But he did not know. He believed he was treating a woman in a troubled marriage. He did not know he was treating a woman who was already being poisoned in her own kitchen. On the morning of December 3rd, 1998, Mark Jensen called for help. Julie was unresponsive in their bed. Emergency crews arrived. There was nothing they could do. Julie was pronounced dead in the home she had been so afraid to die in. Mark told investigators that his wife had been sick for about 3 days. He described no violence, no dramatic event, no struggle. Just a woman who had seemed unwell, gotten progressively worse, and then quietly slipped away. The first responders did not find anything obviously suspicious. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no visible trauma. There was only a woman in her 40s, dead in her bed, in a house where everything looked ordinary. But a child had already noticed that something was wrong. A young friend of the Jensen's 8-year-old son, David, later told investigators something chilling. He said that David had told him his mother was sick, and that his father would not take her to the hospital. The other boy's mother placed that conversation on the very day Julie died. So here's the truth that sits at the heart of this case. A child understood that Julie needed help, and the one adult who was in a position to get her that help did not do it. The day after Julie's death, the Warts did exactly what she had asked them to do. They went to the police, and they handed over the sealed envelope. When investigators opened it and read the letter inside, the entire case turned on its axis in an instant. A dead woman had named the person she believed would kill her. She had predicted her own death in writing, and she had included a photograph of a list that, to the people now investigating her death, looked disturbingly like a plan. Imagine being the investigator who unfolded that page. You are looking at a homicide victim reaching across the boundary of death to point directly at a suspect. There's almost nothing like it in the history of American criminal cases. Julie had, in the most literal sense, left behind a witness statement from beyond the grave. Then the toxicology results came back. Ethylene glycol was found in Julie's blood, in her stomach, and in her urine. Antifreeze, the very same substance that the home computer had been searching for in the weeks before she got sick. And critically, the pattern of the poison in her body suggested that she had not taken one large dose all at once, the way a person ending their own life might. The evidence pointed towards smaller amounts, given over a period of days, the slow and patient work of someone who had time and access, and no fear of being caught in the act. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to lock together. Investigators dug into the home computer and found more. They uncovered emails documenting Mark's affair with Kelly Labonte, messages written in the months before Julie died. And within just days of Julie's death, a coworker came forward with something that stunned them. He said Mark had asked him whether it would be appropriate to bring Kelly to the wake or the funeral. Julie had been dead for less than 2 days, and her husband was already asking about his girlfriend's place at the service. The people who attended Julie's visitation noticed it too. Friends and family later said that Mark showed no real grief. He was laughing. He was joking near the casket. One person described it as if he were at a cocktail party, rather than standing beside the body of his dead wife. And within days of the funeral, garbage bags filled with Julie's belongings appeared at the curb outside the home. One witness described it as watching someone try to erase a person from the world. The home computer told a story all its own. The searches had begun in the middle of October, roughly 6 weeks before Julie's death. Drugs and poisoning came first. Then, in November, came toxicology, and a link about ethylene glycol and antifreeze. To the prosecution, that timeline was a smoking gun. Those searches had started long before Julie ever became sick. That sequence, they argued, was the fingerprint of premeditation. It was the pattern of someone planning a poisoning well in advance. The defense would tell a very different story about those same searches. They argued that Julie was intelligent and computer literate enough to have made the searches herself, as part of an elaborate plan to take her own life and frame her husband for her murder. That single disagreement, who sat at that keyboard, would sit at the center of this case for the next 2 decades. Then another former co-worker of Mark's came forward. He told investigators that Mark had once talked to him about websites explaining how to kill a person with a poison that would be undetectable. At the time, it had probably sounded like dark, idle talk. After Julie's death, it took on a terrible new weight. There were even later claims that Mark had spoken about wanting that witness to disappear before he could testify, adding yet another disturbing layer to the portrait that was forming of who Mark Jensen might really be. But here's something that surprises a lot of people when they first learn about this case. Mark Jensen was not arrested right away. He was not arrested that year or the next. It took more than 3 years of painstaking investigation and forensic work before Kenosha County finally charged him with first-degree intentional homicide in the spring of 2002. In the time between Julie's death and that charge, Mark had rebuilt his life on the surface. Kelly Labonte had divorced her own husband, and she and Mark had married. He had constructed a new future, the very future he had seemed to be imagining while his first wife was still warning the world about him. But the investigation had never stopped moving underneath all of it.
His defense strategy was already taking shape, and it was brutal. The argument was that Julie had poisoned herself, that she was depressed and full of rage, that she had both the means and the motive to destroy her husband on her way out of this world, and that she had done exactly that. To Julie's brothers, that theory was not just wrong. It felt like a second murder, this one committed in a courtroom, against their sister's memory and her good name. The first trial did not begin until January of 2008, nearly 10 years after Julie died. Let that sink in. A full decade passed, between the morning Julie was found dead and the morning a jury was finally seated to weigh the evidence against her husband. The years in between had been swallowed up by legal battles over what evidence the jury would be allowed to hear, and Julie's family had to live every one of those years, not knowing whether there would ever be a reckoning at all. Before we go into the courtroom, let me pause for just a second. If you're still with me, thank you, and please make sure you have hit that like button and subscribed, because the next part of this story is where it becomes one of the most important legal cases in the country. It is the part that law students still study today. When the trial finally got underway, before Judge Bruce Schroeder, the prosecution built its case on several pillars. There were the computer searches, there was Mark's affair, there was the financial motive of avoiding a costly divorce, there was testimony about his years of buried resentment over Julie's affair, there was the former co-worker's account of conversations about undetectable poison, and at the center of it all, there was Julie's letter. The prosecution also called a jailhouse informant named Aaron Dillard. Dillard testified that Mark had confessed to him in detail while they were both behind bars. According to Dillard, Mark said he had spiked Julie's orange juice with antifreeze, and when the poison did not kill her quickly enough, he pushed her face into a pillow and held
her down until she was gone. It was explosive testimony. It was also immediately attacked. The defense argued that Dillard had simply read through Mark's legal files and built a story out of them. The trial judge himself openly questioned Dillard's honesty. But the letter was there, Julie's own words, addressed to the police and naming her husband. During their deliberations, the jury asked to see that letter again. Think about that detail. Of everything they had heard over weeks of testimony, the forensics, the witnesses, the experts, the thing the jury wanted to read one more time was the voice of the dead woman herself. After about 30 hours of deliberation, they came back with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Julie's brothers finally had a verdict, 10 years after their sister was taken from them. What none of them knew yet was that the legal fight had barely begun, that the very piece of evidence that had given them justice was about to become the reason it would all be undone. And Mark's lawyers appealed almost immediately, and their argument was built on a cornerstone of the Constitution. The Sixth Amendment guarantees every defendant the right to confront the witnesses against them, to look them in the eye and cross-examine them in open court. But Julie was dead. Mark could never cross-examine her, and yet her letter, which directly accused him of planning her murder, had been read to a jury that convicted him. For a time, the courts allowed it, relying on a legal principle that holds that you cannot use your right to confront a witness as a shield if you are the reason that witness is unavailable. In other words, if you silence the witness, you forfeit the right to complain that you cannot question them. But the legal ground shifted underneath the case. In a separate ruling, the United States Supreme Court tightened the standard, requiring prosecutors to prove that a defendant had acted specifically to prevent a witness from testifying. In 2013, a federal judge overturned Mark Jensen's conviction. In 2015, a federal appeals court found that the admission of Julie's letter had substantially affected the verdict. And in 2021, the Wisconsin Supreme Court confirmed that Julie's statements were testimonial accusations protected by the Constitution, and that they could not be used against Mark in a new trial. The most powerful piece of evidence the prosecution had ever held, Julie's voice from beyond the grave, was about to be taken off the table. Mark Jensen would be tried again. But this time, the jury would never read Julie's letter. The second trial opened in January of 2023, 25 years after Julie's death, before Judge Anthony Milisauskas. A brand new jury sat down without the letter, without the voicemails, without the single most powerful piece of evidence the state had ever possessed. Prosecutors had to rebuild their entire case from what remained, and they did. They leaned on the timeline of the computer searches. They leaned on Kelly Labonte's testimony about the affair. They leaned on the coworker who described Mark asking about bringing his girlfriend to the funeral within 2 days of Julie's death. They called witnesses who remembered Mark laughing at the wake, and who remembered the garbage bags full of Julie's belongings appearing at the curb. One witness told the new jury that it had felt like watching someone erase a person. The medical evidence was fought just as hard the second time around. The prosecution argued that Julie had been poisoned over a period of days, sedated with a sleep medication, and ultimately suffocated. The defense argued that the evidence was inconclusive, and that it remained consistent with suicide. But under cross-examination, even the defense's own toxicology expert conceded that the evidence was not necessarily inconsistent with someone having pushed Julie's face into a pillow. Even the witness called to help Mark could not fully close that door. There was more. Mark's own sister testified that Julie had told her she believed Mark wanted to kill her, and that she had offered Julie and the children a place to stay. Julie had stayed in the house anyway. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most haunting facts in the case. There was a door open. There was a sister-in-law willing to take Julie and the boys in, and still Julie stayed, because leaving is never as simple as walking out a door, especially when there are 2 young children and a husband who controls the home, the finances, and the family's public face. A rebuttal witness told the jury something that cut straight through the defense's portrait of a hopeless suicidal woman. Julie, that witness said, had been planning to leave after the holidays. She had an exit strategy.
She was not a woman falling apart and giving up. She was a woman waiting for the right moment to get herself and her sons out, doing the careful, dangerous math that every person in her position has to do. The defense's central claim, repeated across both trials, was that Julie had taken her own life to frame her husband. But consider what that theory actually asked you to believe. It asked you to believe that a devoted mother of 2 young boys, who wrote in her own letter that her children were her entire world, and that she would never leave them, chose to die, a slow, agonizing death by poison over a period of days. It asks you to believe she did this while leaving behind voicemails, a logbook, a letter, and a photograph, all designed to send an innocent man to prison for the rest of his life. And it asks you to believe she planned all of this while also, according to a witness, quietly planning to move out after the holidays. At a certain point, the weight of all those contradictions becomes impossible to carry. The jury, hearing it all a second time and without the letter, did not carry it. The jury deliberated for roughly 6.5 hours. On the 1st of February, 2023, they found Mark Jensen guilty, once again, of first-degree intentional homicide. The sentencing landed on a date heavy with meaning, the 14th of April, the anniversary of the day Mark and Julie had married, back in 1984. Julie's brothers spoke in court, and Mark's 2 sons, now grown men, were divided in a way that breaks the heart. Douglas, who had been a small child when his mother died and carried no real memory of her, asked for the maximum sentence and described a childhood shaped by absence and grief. David, who had been 8 when Julie died and still held memories of his father as a parent, asked that the possibility of parole remain open. Mark addressed the court and maintained his innocence to the end. The judge was not moved. He gave Mark Jensen life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge said that Mark could have simply divorced Julie. He could have separated from her and built the life he wanted with someone else. Instead, the judge said, he chose to torture her over a long period of time, and the crime he carried out was planned, researched, and intentional. Let's step back for a moment and look at how investigators actually proved this, because it is one of the most remarkable parts of the entire story. This was what investigators call a pure circumstantial case. There were no eyewitnesses to a killing. There was no surviving physical evidence of direct violence. There was no confession anyone could fully trust. Every single thing had to be assembled from fragments. And then, when the most important fragment of all was removed, the whole case had to be rebuilt a second time, and proven all over again. The toxicology was the foundation. Ethylene glycol is colorless, and it tastes sweet, which is part of what makes antifreeze so dangerous. Back in 1998, it was not something a medical examiner would automatically test for. The first examination of Julie's body did not reveal a cause of death. Then, the only reason this ever became a murder investigation at all is that the toxicology was eventually pursued aggressively, and that Julie's own letter had already pointed investigators toward poisoning as a possibility. In a very real sense, Julie helped solve her own murder. The computer evidence was the second great pillar. The deleted browser history laid out a 6-week progression. Drugs and poisoning in October, toxicology in November, ethylene glycol and antifreeze in the final weeks of Julie's life. The prosecution's strongest argument was the sequence itself. Those searches had started long before Julie ever showed a single symptom. That is not consistent with a person researching suicide after deciding to end their life. It is consistent with someone planning a poisoning, step by step in advance.
The suffocation theory was more complicated, and it was never fully resolved. It emerged years after the death, built in part on the account of the jailhouse informant. Defense experts argued the physical evidence did not support it. But here's the crucial point. By 2023, the jury did not need to resolve the suffocation question at all. The ethylene glycol poisoning alone, if administered by Mark, was enough to support a conviction for first-degree intentional homicide. The retrial proved something that prosecutors and law students will study for a long time. Circumstantial evidence, properly assembled, can outlast the removal of even its single most powerful piece. The state lost the letter. The state still won. There's also a psychological dimension to this case that deserves to be understood, because it explains so much of what people find hard to understand from the outside. The Jensen case is, in many ways, a textbook example of what researchers call coercive control. This is a form of abuse defined not by dramatic physical violence, but by ongoing domination, humiliation, and a slow wearing down of another person. Based on the public evidence, Mark Jensen does not appear to have been a man who hit his wife. The abuse that was alleged was designed to leave no visible marks at all. The pornographic photographs, the hang-up calls, the constant low hum of cruelty that drove Julie to keep a logbook just to hold on to her own sense of reality. These are the hallmarks of a calculated campaign to destabilize a person. The goal of that kind of abuse is not injury. The goal is control. The point is to keep the target off balance, ashamed, and uncertain of her own perception of the world. To the outside world, Mark was a professional, a father, a neighbor. Inside that home, Julie appears to have been living in a completely different reality. This gap between the public man and the private one is one of the most chilling features of coercive control. The abuser is often charming, competent, and well-liked. Neighbors describe him as a good guy. Co-workers have no complaints. That public reputation becomes a kind of armor, because when the victim finally tries to tell someone what is happening behind closed doors, the response is disbelief. Surely not him. He seems so normal. That disbelief is not a side effect of this kind of abuse. It is part of how it works. It is part of what keeps the victim trapped. And Julie's response to her own fear is, from a psychological standpoint, deeply significant. She documented everything. She told multiple people.
She created evidence because somewhere along the way she had learned, consciously or not, that she might not be believed. She was, in a sense, fighting the disbelief in advance. She was building a case that could speak for her even after she was gone, precisely because she understood how easy it would be for the world to look at her charming, successful husband and conclude that the frightened wife was the unstable one. And yes, she stayed. People always ask why a person in that situation stays, but staying is not weakness, and it is not the same as not knowing. It's the documented reality of coercive control, leaving is statistically the single most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship, and many victims sense that danger acutely, even when they cannot put it into words. Remember, a witness testified that Julie did have a plan. She was going to leave after the holidays. She was waiting for the safest moment she could find. Mark's behavior after Julie's death is its own kind of evidence. Asking about bringing his girlfriend to the funeral 2 days after his wife died is not grief. The garbage bags of her belongings at the curb within days of the service are not grief. That is the behavior of someone who had already, in his own mind, closed the chapter long before. Grief disorganizes a person, it slows them down, it makes the ordinary tasks of life feel impossible. What the witnesses described was the opposite. It was efficiency. It was a man moving briskly into the next phase of a life he had already been planning while his wife was still alive and still afraid. And at the sentencing, 25 years later, the sight of his 2 sons split down the middle reflects something trauma researchers understand well. One son, Douglas, had been too young to form real memories of his mother, and he asked the court for the maximum punishment. The other,
son David, had been old enough to remember his father as a parent who loved him, and he asked that the door to parole stay open. Neither boy was wrong. They were simply standing in 2 different places, shaped by 2 different sets of memories. Loyalty, especially the loyalty of a child, often forms around what a person remembers, not around what the evidence eventually reveals. 2 brothers raised in the aftermath of the same tragedy arrived at the same courtroom carrying completely different fathers in their minds. That too is part of the long shadow this crime cast over a family. So let's end where this story truly belongs. Not with the man in the prison cell, but with the woman who saw it all coming. Julie Jensen did everything right. She documented, she reported, she warned, she told her neighbors, her son's teacher, her doctor, and the police. She wrote it all down and sealed it in an envelope so that her own voice could speak even if she could not. She loved her 2 sons more than she feared what was closing in on her, and she was making a plan to get all 3 of them to safety. And still, she did not make it out in time. It is tempting to see this as a story about a system that failed her, and in some ways it is. The harassment was reported and never solved. The fear was spoken aloud and never acted upon in time. A doctor handed out a sedative to the very man who would use it. But there is another way to see this story, and I think it is the truer one. Julie Jensen did not fail. The people in the systems around her failed to act on what she gave them, but Julie herself did everything within her power. She fought the only way a person in her position could fight, with paper and persistence and the sheer refusal to be erased. And in the end, it worked. Not in time to save her life, but in time to save the truth. She deserves so much more than what this world gave her, but because of what she left behind. Because she had the foresight and the courage to name her own killer before he could silence her. The man who took her life will die, behind bars. Julie could not save herself. But in the end, her own words helped make sure that the truth did not die with her. She is the reason this case was ever a murder investigation at all. She is the reason a jury convicted, not once, but twice, across 25 years and 2 trials. A woman who was afraid no one would believe her ended up being believed by everyone who mattered. That is not a small thing. That is a kind of victory that reached out from beyond the grave. If this story moved you, share it with someone, because the more people who know Julie's name, the more her courage means. Leave a comment and tell me this. Do you think this was justice for Julie, or just the closest thing a broken system could manage? And let me know one more time where you are watching from and what time it is right now where you are. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next case. This has been Dark Truth Crime. I'll see you in the next one.